Everything this series has explored began with one man, the daughter who went into the sea and was given back, the warrior who killed a boy on a beach and prayed for him for the rest of his life, the woman who rode beside Yoshinaka and would not leave until he ordered her to, the man who burned the Buddha and spent his final months in prayer, the commander who secured 2 anchors and stepped off his ship, the grandson who left his wife and children and walked toward Nachi, the head of the clan who could not choose at Dan Nura, the boy with the flute inside his helmet, the son who spent his life trying to stop his father and ran out of time. All of them were shaped by one man. All of their stories exist because of one man. That man was Taira Kiyomori. He was born in 1118, though even this simple fact is complicated by the specific circumstances of his birth, circumstances that the Heike Monogatari presents with a quality of deliberate ambiguity that suggests the writers understood they were recording not simply a historical event, but the origin point of a legend. The ambiguity concerns his father. Kiyomori was raised as the son of Tairano Tadamori, a warrior of significant standing whose own career had laid the foundations on which Kiyomori would build. By birth order and by formal acknowledgement, Tadamori was Kiyomori's father, but the rumors said something different. The rumors said that Kiyomori's actual father was Shirakawa Ho-Oh, the retired Emperor Shirakawa, one of the most powerful figures in Japanese politics in the early 12th century, a man whose reign and retirement had both been characterized by the specific kind of political dominance that the retired emperor institution allowed, the ability to exercise real power from outside the formal structures that constrained the reigning emperor. The story, as the Heike Monogatari presents it, is this. Tadamori had been granted a rare privilege by Shirakawa Ho-Oh, the privilege of access to the imperial presence at night, an honor that the chronicles present as the emperor's acknowledgement of Tadamori's exceptional service. On one such occasion, Shirakawa Ho-Oh was with a woman he favored, a woman who was pregnant with his child. He gave this woman to Tadamori. He asked Tadamori to raise the child as his own. The child was Kiyomori. Whether this story is true is a question that historians have debated for 8 centuries, and that the historical record does not permit to be resolved with certainty. The blood of retired emperors did not leave documentary traces in the 12th century in the way that would allow modern verification, but the story's persistence, the fact that it was included in the Heike Monogatari, and that it has been told in various forms as part of Kiyomori's origin for 8 centuries, suggests that it served a purpose in how people understood him, that the ambiguity of his parentage was felt, by those who told his story, to be somehow essential to understanding who he was and what he became. If Kiyomori was the son of Shirakawa Ho-Oh, then the man who built the Taira ascendancy, who placed his daughter in the imperial household and his grandson on the imperial throne, who spent his life accumulating power over the imperial institution, was himself, in some sense, of imperial blood. The warrior who seemed to be reaching above his station was, by this reading, reaching towards something that was already, in some sense, his. This is not in itself a resolution of the ambiguity. It is, rather, an exploration of what the ambiguity means, what it reveals about the specific quality of Kiyomori's ambition and his relationship to the power he pursued. A man who might be of imperial blood, pursuing control over the imperial institution. A warrior who might be something more than a warrior, building a position that no warrior had previously occupied. The ambiguity is the point. Kiyomori, from the very beginning, was not simply what he appeared to be. He grew up in the warrior world, whatever his actual parentage. Tadamori, his formal father, was a capable military commander whose service to the court had earned him unusual privileges and unusual trust, the kind of trust that a warrior needed to earn from the court aristocracy in order to be of genuine use to it, rather than simply a force to be managed. Taramori taught Kiyomori the warrior's skills, the riding and the archery and the sword, and also the something else that distinguished Taramori from the ordinary run of warrior commanders, the understanding that the relationship between warrior capability and court legitimacy was not simply a transaction, but something more complex, a relationship that needed to be cultivated with as much care as any military skill. Kiyomori absorbed this understanding. He also absorbed the martial capability that was the foundation of everything else. By the time Taramori died, in 1153, when Kiyomori was 35 years old, Kiyomori was already established as one of the significant warrior figures of his generation, already someone whose combination of military capability and political awareness made him a figure of consequence within the specific ecosystem of power that defined Heian Japan. He was not yet what he would become, but the foundation was in place. The ambition was there. The specific combination of qualities that would allow him to achieve what no warrior before him had achieved was present, waiting for the circumstances that would allow it to be expressed. Those circumstances were coming. The circumstances that allowed Kiyomori's specific combination of qualities to express itself came, as they so often do in Japanese history, in the form of a succession dispute. The year was 1156. The dispute was over who would occupy the throne, and more importantly, who would control the person who occupied it. The event is known as the Hogeno Run, the Hogan Disturbance, and it is, in retrospect, one of the hinge points of Japanese history, the moment when the long-developing tension between the political forms of the Heian court and the military reality of the warrior clans reached a crisis that could not be managed through the usual instruments of political accommodation. The specific details of the Hogan disturbance involve the competing claims of the reigning emperor Sutoku, who had been forced to abdicate, and his successor, and the way that these competing claims aligned with other fault lines in the political landscape, divisions within the Fujiwara family, divisions within the imperial family itself, and, critically, divisions within the warrior clans whose military force would determine which political faction prevailed. Kiyomori chose the winning side. This is, in one sense, all that needs to be said about Kiyomori's role in the Hogan disturbance, because the choice of the winning side is, in the logic of political conflict, the choice that determines everything else. But the way Kiyomori made this choice, and what he did with the position the choice secured him, reveals something essential about the specific quality of his political intelligence. He chose correctly. He fought effectively. He supported the side that prevailed, the side that represented the reigning emperor and the political faction associated with him. And having supported the winning side, he was in a position to receive the rewards that victory made available, the appointments and the lands and the formal acknowledgement of status that the court distributed to those whose military service had produced the outcome. But Kiyomori did not simply receive these rewards passively. He understood that what the Hogan disturbance had created was not simply an opportunity to be rewarded, but an opportunity to be positioned, to be placed within the political landscape in a way that would allow him to continue accumulating the specific kind of influence that he understood mattered. The Hogan disturbance was also, and this is important for understanding everything that followed, a moment that demonstrated the military irrelevance of the court aristocracy. The great families of the Heian court, the Fujiwara and the others who had managed the imperial household for centuries, had survived as political forces precisely because they had been able to manage the warriors, to use warrior capability in service of political goals without allowing that capability to become the primary determinant of political outcomes. The Hogan disturbance changed this. What the disturbance demonstrated, for anyone who was paying attention, was that military force was now the actual currency of political power, that the elaborate rituals and the careful management of precedent and the distribution of ranks and titles that had sustained the court's authority for centuries were dependent, for their continued operation, on the willingness of people with swords to respect them. Kiyomori was paying attention. 3 years later, in 1159, the second crisis arrived. This one is known as the Heiji no Run, the Heiji disturbance, and it was, in some ways, more consequential than the Hogan disturbance, because it involved not just the question of which political faction would prevail, but the direct question of which warrior family would dominate. The Heiji disturbance was, at its core, a conflict between the Taira and the Minamoto, the two great warrior families whose rivalry would eventually produce the Genpei War. In 1159, the Minamoto, under Minamoto no Yoshitomo, moved against the Taira in a sudden attack that, for a brief period, appeared to give the Minamoto the upper hand. Kiyomori was not in the capital when the attack came. He was returning from a pilgrimage, and the timing of the attack had been calculated to take advantage of his absence. He returned. This is the moment, in many tellings of Kiyomori's story, that is presented as the decisive demonstration of his quality. The moment when the man who had chosen correctly in the Hogan disturbance showed that he was not simply lucky, but genuinely capable. He returned to a capital that the Minamoto had, temporarily, seized. He assessed the situation. He moved. The response he organized was swift and effective, exactly the kind of response that the combination of military capability and political awareness that Kiyomori had been developing for decades was designed to produce. The Minamoto attack was reversed. Yoshitomo was defeated. The Taira prevailed. What Kiyomori did in the aftermath of the Heiji disturbance was something that had not been done before in quite this way, something that revealed the specific quality of his thinking about power and about the relationship between military victory and political position. He spared Yoshitomo's sons, not all of them. The oldest sons were executed, as the warrior logic of eliminating potential future rivals would require, but the youngest sons were spared, allowed to live in exile, scattered to distant provinces, apparently too young and too powerless to represent a threat. One of these youngest sons was Minamoto no Yoritomo. Kiyomori's decision to spare Yoritomo is one of the most discussed decisions in Japanese history, the decision that, in retrospect, made the Genpei War possible, that created the conditions for everything this series has been exploring. Why did Kiyomori spare him? The Heike Monogatari presents various explanations, some involving the intercession of a woman who pleaded for the child's life, some involving Kiyomori's own assessment that the boy was too young to be a genuine threat. The question of why exactly Kiyomori made this decision is one that history cannot answer with certainty. What history can say is that the decision was made, that Yoritomo lived, that Yoritomo grew up in exile in the eastern provinces, and that 20 years later, Yoritomo raised his standard and began the war that destroyed everything Kiyomori had built. Kiyomori, who had spared Yoritomo, did not live to see the destruction. He died in 1181, 2 years into the war he had made possible by the decision he made in 1159. The sparing of Yoritomo is the hinge on which everything turns, and the man who made this decision, whatever his reasons, had no way of knowing, in 1159, what it would eventually mean. After the Heiji disturbance, Kiyomori was the dominant military figure in Japan. This is not an exaggeration. The Minamoto, the family whose rivalry with the Taira had defined the political landscape of the warrior world for generations, had been effectively destroyed as a political force. Yoshitomo was dead. The older sons were dead. The surviving sons were in exile, scattered, apparently neutralized. The Taira had won, Kiyomori had won, and now came the question that this specific victory, in the specific circumstances of 1160s Japan, made possible to ask in a way it had never been possible to ask before. What do you do with a victory like this? Previous warrior commanders who had achieved military dominance had, typically, done one of two things with that dominance. They had used it to accumulate land and formal appointments, to secure for themselves and their families a position within the existing hierarchies of the Heian system, a position that acknowledged their military importance while leaving the fundamental structure of the system intact. Or they had overreached, had pushed too hard against the limits that the system imposed on warrior power, and had triggered the kind of reaction that eventually brought them down. Kiyomori did neither of these things, exactly. He did something that had not been done before, something that required a specific combination of ambition and patience and political intelligence that, combined with the military capability he had already demonstrated, made him uniquely capable of attempting it. He joined the system, not in the passive sense of accepting a position within the existing hierarchy, in the active sense of inserting himself into the system at the level where actual power resided, transforming himself from a warrior who operated at the margins of the court into a courtier who happened to command an army. The process of this transformation is one of the most remarkable in Japanese history, and it is worth following in some detail, because it is the foundation of everything else that follows. In 1160, the year after the Heiji disturbance, Kiyomori received an appointment that placed him formally within the court hierarchy, a position that acknowledged his military importance and also, crucially, integrated him into the ceremonial and administrative structures of the court itself. This appointment was not the highest position available. It was a significant step, but there were further steps to take, further positions in the court hierarchy that carried greater prestige and greater formal authority. Kiyomori took those steps. Methodically, over the following decade and a half, he accumulated appointments and titles and positions that moved him steadily upward through the court hierarchy, from significant warrior commander to something that the court hierarchy had no pre-existing category for. The court aristocracy watched this process with a mixture of calculation and alarm. The calculation was the calculation that powerful people always make when they encounter someone whose power they cannot simply ignore, the calculation of how to accommodate this person in a way that manages their influence without simply surrendering to it. The alarm was the alarm of people who understood, at some level, that what Kiyomori was doing was not simply seeking a higher position within the existing system, but transforming the system itself, that the insertion of a warrior of his capabilities into the court hierarchy at the level where he was inserting himself was changing what the court hierarchy was. But they could not stop him. The military reality of the Heiji disturbance had demonstrated that, whatever the court's preferences might be, the decision about who held power in Japan had been made by swords rather than by precedent, and the man with the swords was Kiyomori. By 1167, Kiyomori had reached the position of Dazio Daijin, the Grand Minister of State, the highest formal position in the Japanese administrative hierarchy, a position that had been, in previous centuries, the preserve of the most senior Fujiwara and their allies. A warrior had never held this position. The fact that Kiyomori held it represented, more than any other single event in his career up to this point, the specific transformation he had been working toward, the completion, in formal terms, of the movement from the warrior world into the court world. He did not hold this position for long, resigning after a few months, which was consistent with the specific way power operated in the Heian system, where formal offices were often less important than the informal networks of relationship and obligation that the holder of such an office could develop and maintain. but the fact that he had held it, that a warrior had held the highest administrative office in Japan, changed what was possible. It changed what Kiyomori was, and it changed what the Taira could be. What Kiyomori was by the late 1160s was something for which the existing vocabulary of the Heian world did not have an entirely adequate term. He was not simply a warrior, not in the sense that the warrior identity had previously been understood, a man whose power was military and whose relationship to the court was instrumental, a tool the court used and that needed to be managed, so it did not exceed its proper function. He was not simply a courtier, not in the sense that the court aristocracy understood themselves, men and women whose power derived from the accumulated prestige of ancient lineage and the specific kind of cultivation that only centuries of aristocratic tradition could produce. He was something in between, or something that contained both, a man whose military capability was the foundation of his position and whose political sophistication had allowed him to use that foundation to build something that went far beyond what any previous warrior had built. He was, in the most direct sense, the most powerful person in Japan, and he had not yet finished. The transformation from warrior to politician, in Kiyomori's case, was not a replacement of one identity by another. It was an addition, a layering of the political skills and the court relationships on top of the military foundation that had made everything else possible, so that the result was not a warrior who had become a courtier, or a courtier who happened to command warriors, but something more genuinely hybrid, a person who moved between these worlds with a facility that neither world, on its own, could have produced. This hybridity was, in some sense, Kiyomori's greatest achievement, and also, ultimately, the source of the specific kind of failure that produced the conditions for the Genpei War. The court world that Kiyomori inserted himself into was, by the 1160s, a world that had been managing its relationship with warrior power for decades, through a combination of formal recognition, strategic marriage, and the careful distribution of appointments that gave warriors the status they sought while maintaining the court's nominal control over the structures through which that status was distributed. This management strategy had worked, more or less, for the previous generation of warrior commanders. It had worked with Kiyomori's own father Tadamori, who had accepted the positions the court offered, and had not pushed beyond what the court was comfortable with. Kiyomori pushed, not in a way that was immediately recognizable as pushing, not in a way that produced an obvious crisis in the early stages. The pushing was patient, methodical, organized around an understanding of how the court's systems of precedent and appointment and formal hierarchy actually worked, an understanding that Kiyomori had been developing since his earliest involvement with the court, and that, by the 1160s, was probably more sophisticated than the understanding possessed by many of the court families who had grown up inside these systems. The specific instrument of Kiyomori's most consequential political moves was marriage, not his own marriage, though that too had its political dimensions. The marriages he arranged for the members of his family, the strategic placement of Taira women into the households of the court aristocracy, and, eventually, into the imperial household itself. This is a practice that the Fujiwara had perfected over centuries, the practice of using daughters as instruments of alliance, of placing the most eligible young women of the family into positions where their children would carry Fujiwara blood into the most important households in Japan. Kiyomori studied this practice. He understood it, and he applied it with the same combination of ambition and patience that characterized everything else he did. The culmination of this marriage strategy, the move that represented the full expression of what Kiyomori had been building toward, was the placement of his daughter Tokuko into the imperial household as the consort of the Emperor Takakura. This series has described this from Tokuko's perspective, in the series devoted to her story as kenreimon-in, the series that begins with her departure from her father's household at 14 and follows her through the imperial household to the retreat from Kyoto to the sea at Donnura. From Kiyomori's perspective, the same event looks different. It was the completion of a strategy, the moment when the political program he had been pursuing since the Heiji disturbance reached the specific form he had been building toward. His daughter was in the imperial household. Her children would carry Taira blood. The next emperor could be his grandson. The court families understood what this meant. They had seen the Fujiwara play this game for centuries. They understood the logic of placing a family's women in the imperial household and then managing the succession to ensure that the children of those women became emperors. They had lived inside the world that this logic had produced, the world in which the Fujiwara's dominance had rested, for generations, on exactly this kind of strategic marriage and managed succession. And now the Taira were playing the same game. The court family's alarm, in the face of Kiyomori's maneuvering, was the alarm of people who recognized what was happening and understood that they did not have the tools to stop it. The political skills Kiyomori was deploying were the court's own skills. The institutional mechanisms he was using were the court's own mechanisms. He was not attacking the system. He was using the system against the people who had built it. Kiyomori's political genius in this period was precisely this: the ability to use the instruments that the Heian court had developed for its own purposes, in service of purposes that the court had not intended and would not have approved. The marriage politics that the Fujiwara had used to maintain aristocratic dominance, Kiyomori used to insert warrior blood into the imperial succession. The appointment system that the court had used to acknowledge warrior service while keeping warriors within defined limits, Kiyomori used to accumulate formal authority that went far beyond those limits. The networks of obligation and relationship that had structured court politics for centuries, Kiyomori used to build a web of connections that made the Taira central to more relationships than any warrior family had previously been central to. He was using the court's own tools. He was doing it better than the court, and the court could not stop him, because stopping him would have required either military force, which the court did not have, and which had been the decisive argument in every confrontation since the Hogan disturbance, or the kind of political sophistication that could match Kiyomori's at his own game, which the court by this point also did not have. Kiyomori won. The question, in the early 1170s, was not whether he had won, it was whether winning in this way was actually what it appeared to be. Kiyomori was an architect. Not literally, though the building he commissioned, the great shrine complex at Itsukushima, the shrine on the island in the inland sea, whose vermilion pillars rise from the tidal waters, is one of the most beautiful structures in Japan and remains, 8 centuries after Kiyomori ordered its construction, a testament to his aesthetic ambitions as well as his political ones. But architect in the larger sense, the sense of a person who understands that the most durable achievements are not the ones built from simple accumulation of power, but the ones built from the careful arrangement of relationships and structures that reinforce each other, that hold together, not because any single element is strong enough on its own, but because the whole is designed so that each element supports the others. The architecture Kiyomori built was the architecture of the Taira's position in Japan. He placed his sons in military commands, distributed across the provinces in a pattern that gave the Taira genuine reach into the territories that mattered for military and economic control. He placed his daughters in noble households, the strategic marriages that bound the court families to the Taira through the obligations that family relationships created. He placed his daughters, specifically Tokuko, at the center of the imperial household, creating the bloodline connection that was, ultimately, the most durable form of institutional claim. He managed the appointments that flowed from the court, ensuring that the positions carrying real administrative authority were occupied by people whose connection to the Taira made them, in practice, extensions of Taira power. This architecture required maintenance. Unlike a building, which, once constructed, maintains its structure through the physical properties of its materials, a political architecture requires continuous attention, the constant management of the relationships and the appointments and the obligations that give it its form. Kiyomori provided this maintenance. The accounts of his activity during the 1160s and 1170s describe a man in constant motion, managing a web of relationships and negotiations and decisions that would have been overwhelming to anyone who did not have both the intelligence and the stamina that Kiyomori possessed. He was not simply accumulating power in some abstract sense, he was building something specific, a structure that would, if maintained, allow the Taira to continue dominating Japan after his own death. The model he was working from was, in some ways, the Fujiwara model, the model that had allowed a single aristocratic family to dominate Japanese politics for centuries through the strategic use of marriage and appointment and the management of the imperial succession. But Kiyomori's version of this model had a specific difference that made it more powerful and ultimately more fragile than the Fujiwara version. The Fujiwara had built their position on the cultivation of genuine relationships with the imperial household, relationships that were, whatever their political dimensions, also personal, grounded in the specific human connections that centuries of propinquity and shared ceremony had produced. Kiyomori's position was built more directly on the demonstration of military force as the foundation of political authority. The Fujiwara had made the court dependent on them because the court could not imagine functioning without them. Kiyomori made the court dependent on him because the court could not function against him. This difference is subtle but important. Dependence that comes from genuine need, from the sense that a certain person or family provides something that cannot be provided any other way, is durable in a way that dependence that comes from the inability to resist is not. The Fujiwara, at their height, were genuinely indispensable to the court's functioning. The court families had, over centuries, developed such deep relationships with the Fujiwara that the idea of the court without the Fujiwara was, for most purposes, simply inconceivable. Kiyomori's position, while resting on the same formal structures, was built on a foundation that could, in principle, be challenged by anyone with sufficient military force to make the challenge credible. He had eliminated the Minamoto, but he had not eliminated the possibility of challenge. He had not made his position so genuinely indispensable, so woven into the fabric of what the court was and how it functioned, that the removal of the Taira would require the reimagining of the entire system. Shigemori, his son, understood this. This is what the conflict between them was ultimately about, not simply the specific decisions about how to treat Go-Shirakawa or how to respond to this or that political challenge, but the deeper question of whether the Taira's position was being built on foundations that would last. Shigemori believed the foundations were inadequate. He believed that the military foundation, however impressively constructed, needed to be supplemented by genuine legitimacy, by the kind of relationship with the court establishment and the imperial institution that would make the Taira genuinely indispensable rather than simply overwhelmingly powerful. Kiyomori disagreed, not necessarily in explicit argument, but in the consistent pattern of his choices, which were the choices of a man who believed that sufficient force, skillfully applied, was its own legitimacy. The architecture Kiyomori built was extraordinary. It was the most ambitious thing any warrior had attempted in Japanese history up to that point. It produced, for a decade and more, a world that looked from the outside like exactly what Kiyomori had intended it to look like. The Taira were at the center of everything. The emperor was Kiyomori's grandson. The regalia was in Taira hands. The court functioned, as it had always functioned, but now with the Taira as its organizing principle rather than the Fujiwara. The architecture held, until it didn't. The peak of the Taira's power and of Kiyomori's personal achievement arrived in stages across the 1170s and into the early 1180s, each stage representing another element of the architecture he had been building clicking into place. The marriage of his daughter Tokuko to the Emperor Takakura in the early 1170s was one of these stages, the moment when the political marriage strategy that Kiyomori had been pursuing reached the specific form he had been working toward. But the marriage was only the beginning. The child that the marriage would produce was the goal. In 1178, Tokuko gave birth to a son. The child's name was Tokuhito. He was the son of the Emperor Takakura and the daughter of Tyranno Kiyomori. He was, in other words, exactly what Kiyomori had been positioning the family to produce for the better part of 2 decades. A child who was simultaneously imperial and Taira. A child whose claim to the throne was legitimate by the standards of the imperial succession, and whose blood connection to the Taira gave Kiyomori's family a claim on the imperial institution that went beyond the merely political. In 1180, when Tokuhito was 2 years old, he was enthroned as emperor. He is known to history as Antoku Tenno, the Emperor Antoku, and his reign, though it lasted only 5 years and ended at Dannura when he was 8 years old, is one of the most consequential in Japanese history, not because of anything that happened during the reign itself, but because of what the reign represented and what its ending meant. He was the culmination of everything Kiyomori had built, an emperor of Taira blood, sitting on the throne of Japan, surrounded by the apparatus of imperial legitimacy that the Taira now controlled. Kiyomori had done what the Fujiwara had done. He had placed his blood on the throne. The moment of Tokuhito's enthronement was, by any measure, the peak of Kiyomori's achievement, the moment when the trajectory from the Hogan disturbance to here, the 2 decades of accumulation and maneuvering and strategic marriage, and the careful cultivation of court relationships, reached its apparent culmination. The man who had been born in uncertain circumstances, who may or may not have been the illegitimate son of a retired emperor, who had risen from the warrior world into the court world, and had used the court's own instruments to build a position no warrior had previously occupied, had placed his grandson on the throne of Japan. If the story had ended here, the Kiyomori of history would be a different figure, a man whose ambition and capability had produced something extraordinary, something unprecedented, something that might have become the foundation of a new political order. But the story did not end here. Kiyomori was 62 years old when Tokuhito was enthroned. He had spent 40 years building toward this moment, and the moment was genuine, the peak was real, the achievement was everything he had said it would be. But the achievement had been built on a foundation that was, as Shigemori had understood, and as the events of the next 5 years would demonstrate, more precarious than it appeared from the top. The rebellion that Yoritomo had been preparing in the eastern provinces was ready. The resentments that Kiyomori's methods had generated in the court establishment and in the provinces and among the warrior families who had not been incorporated into the Taira's web of relationships had been accumulating for years. The peak was real. So was the edge. The 1180s began with Kiyomori at the height of his power and at the beginning of the end of it. The rebellion of Minamoto no Yoritomo in the summer of 1180 was the opening event of the crisis that would destroy the world Kiyomori had built. Not immediately. The rebellion's early progress was uneven, its outcome uncertain in the first months, the eastern provinces far from the capital, and the Minamoto's initial forces small relative to the Taira's military resources. But the rebellion had started, and the man who had made it possible, the man who had spared Yoritomo's life in 1159, rather than executing the 9-year-old boy who would become the leader of the force that destroyed the Taira, that man was now 62 years old and ill, his body already beginning the process that would, within a year, end his life. Kiyomori had built the world. He would not live to see it fall, but the falling had begun. The overreach that this series has discussed in the context of Shigemori's story, the pattern of decisions that progressively undermined the legitimacy that the Taira's position required to be durable, needs to be examined now from the other side, from the perspective of the man who was making these decisions, to understand what Kiyomori was thinking and what he believed he was doing. Because Kiyomori was not simply reckless, he was not a man who acted without thought, who pushed against limits because he lacked the awareness that limits existed. He was one of the most politically sophisticated figures in Japanese history. He understood how the systems worked. He understood the value of legitimacy. He had spent decades demonstrating his understanding of these things through the patient, methodical accumulation of position and relationship that produced the world of the 1170s. So what was the overreach about? The most honest answer is that it was about the specific quality of Kiyomori's intelligence, and the specific limitation that that intelligence contained. Kiyomori understood power instrumentally, as a tool to be accumulated and deployed in service of specific goals. He understood the court systems instrumentally, as mechanisms that could be used to achieve outcomes. He understood relationships instrumentally, as networks of obligation and interest that could be managed in service of the family's position. This instrumental understanding was the source of his greatest achievements. The same understanding of how the systems worked that allowed him to use them so effectively was also what prevented him from fully appreciating what the systems were, beyond their instrumental function. The Heian court systems were not simply tools. They were also, and more fundamentally, the specific form that Japanese civilization had given to the question of how power should be organized and exercised, the accumulated answer, refined over centuries, to the question of what made authority legitimate and what obligations came with legitimate authority. Kiyomori's instrumental understanding allowed him to use these systems brilliantly. It did not allow him to fully inhabit them in the way that would have given his use of them the specific quality of genuine legitimacy, as distinct from the appearance of legitimacy that the formal structures could produce without the underlying substance. Shigemori inhabited these systems. That is the difference this series has been describing throughout the story of their relationship. Kiyomori used them. Shigemori believed in them. The Shishitani incident of 1177, the conspiracy of those who opposed Kiyomori's dominance and Kiyomori's response to it, which this series has discussed in the context of Shigemori's intervention, represents one of the clearest expressions of this difference. Kiyomori's initial impulse upon learning of the conspiracy was to arrest Go-Shirakawa. This was, from a purely instrumental perspective, a logical response to the specific threat that Go-Shirakawa's continued political activity represented. But it was a response that, from the perspective of what the Taira's position actually required for its long-term survival, was catastrophic, the kind of action that, by violating the most basic norms of the court's political culture, would generate the specific kind of resentment that had no outlet except rebellion. Shigemori stopped him, not because Shigemori was cautious, not simply because he understood the tactical risks, Because Shigemori believed that the retired emperor's person was genuinely inviolable, that there were obligations that simply could not be set aside without destroying something essential. The decade between the Shishitani incident and Kiyomori's death in 1181 was a decade of accumulating overreach, of decisions that, each individually explicable by the instrumental logic that guided Kiyomori's thinking, collectively produced the conditions for the crisis that eventually destroyed everything. The treatment of Go-Shirakawa became progressively more aggressive, culminating in the arrest that Kiyomori, with Shigemori gone, finally carried out in 1179. The management of court appointments became increasingly blatant in its disregard for the preferences of the court families. The demands that the Taira's provincial dominance imposed on the warrior families of the provinces created resentments that festered without resolution, and the general quality of the Taira's relationship with the institutions they controlled became, progressively, the quality of a relationship defined by force rather than by genuine service. Kiyomori knew all of this. He was not naive about the reactions his methods were generating, but his assessment of these reactions was, ultimately, that they could be managed, that the military dominance that the Taira commanded was sufficient to contain whatever resentment his methods produced, that the specific risks of legitimacy erosion were worth taking in exchange for the specific gains of more direct control. This assessment was wrong, not completely wrong, not immediately wrong, but wrong in the way that matters most, wrong about the timeline, wrong about the threshold at which accumulated resentment becomes something that military dominance can no longer contain. Yoritomo's rebellion was the proof. Kiyomori had been wrong about Yoritomo in 1159. He was wrong, in a different way, about the conditions that might produce another Yoritomo in the 1170s. The rebellion, when it came from the accumulated weight of 2 decades of exactly the decisions that Shigemori had been arguing against. The illness had been present for years before anyone outside Kiyomori's immediate household fully understood how serious it was. This is consistent with what the accounts suggest about Kiyomori's character, a man who had spent his entire career managing how he was perceived, who understood that the appearance of capability and control was itself a form of power, and who would not have willingly allowed a display of physical vulnerability to undermine the impression of strength that his position required. The fever that eventually became the defining symptom of his final illness was, by the accounts that describe it, extraordinary. The chronicles describe Kiyomori's body, in the final stages of his illness, as radiating heat so intense that those around him could not come close without feeling it, a fever so extreme that the water poured on his body to cool, it was said to turn to steam before it reached his skin. This description is not, presumably, literally accurate in all its details. The chronicles of this period often describe extreme states in extreme language, and the specific details of Kiyomori's fever have the quality of the kind of dramatic elaboration that happens when people try to find language adequate to the memory of something that seemed, at the time, larger than ordinary description could contain. But the underlying fact is clear. Kiyomori was, in the final year of his life, seriously ill with a condition that produced extreme heat, that incapacitated him progressively, and that eventually killed him. The question of what this illness was, from a modern medical perspective, is one that historians and physicians have discussed without reaching a definitive answer. The symptoms as described are consistent with several conditions, including severe infections and other serious systemic illnesses. The specific combination of extreme fever and the rapid progression from incapacitation to death within a period of weeks or months is consistent with the kind of acute illness that, in the pre-antibiotic era, could carry off even apparently healthy adults in a short time. What is clear is that the illness was real, that it was severe, and that it was present, in some form, through the period that this series has been discussing, the period of the Hogan and Heiji disturbances, the accumulation of power in the 1160s and 1170s, the arrangement of marriages and appointments, and the decisions and the overreaches that defined Kiyomori's relationship with Shigemori. There is also the matter of Fukuhara. In 1180, the same year that Yoritomo raised his standard and the Genpei War began, Kiyomori made one of the most disruptive decisions of his entire career, the decision to move the capital from Kyoto to a new location on the coast, the site known as Fukuhara, near what is now Kobe. This decision has been discussed in this series in the context of kenreimon-in's story, from her perspective as the woman who had to leave the city she had grown up in. From Kiyomori's perspective, the decision represented something specific. Fukuhara was in the western provinces, closer to the inland sea trade routes that had been the foundation of the Taira's original wealth, closer to the territory where the Taira's roots were deepest. Moving the capital, there was, in one sense, a strategic withdrawal, a repositioning of the court in territory that the Taira controlled more completely than they controlled the ancient capital. But it was also, arguably, a symptom of the illness that had been progressing through Kiyomori's body, an expression of the specific kind of judgment that illness can distort, the grandiosity of a man who had built so much and who, feeling the ground shifting beneath him, reached for the kind of sweeping, dramatic gesture that seemed adequate to the scale of what he had built. The court hated Fukuhara. The move was reversed after 5 months. The court returned to Kyoto. The reversal of the Fukuhara relocation was, in some ways, one of the most damaging episodes of the entire Genpei period for the Taira's standing, not because of the specific military or political consequences of moving and then unmoving the capital, but because of what it demonstrated about Kiyomori's judgment, a man who had built his position on the specific quality of his political intelligence, who had accumulated power over decades precisely because his assessments of the political situation and his calculations of what each situation required had consistently proven more accurate than those of the people around him, had made a decision that was, by any reasonable assessment, a mistake, and had been forced to reverse it after 5 months. The reversal was the right thing to do, but it was also an admission that the original decision had been wrong, and the original decision had been Kiyomori's. Kiyomori, in the last year of his life, was a man whose judgment was being progressively affected by illness, who was losing the specific quality of clear-sightedness that had made him what he was, who was making decisions that the Kiyomori of the 1160s would probably not have made. This is, in its own way, one of the saddest aspects of his story, the fact that the end of his life was characterized by exactly the kind of failure of judgment that he had spent his career avoiding, that the man who had been so consistently more right than the people around him ended his life making decisions that those around him could see were wrong. The fever was consuming him. The world he had built was beginning, at its edges, to come apart. Kiyomori was still alive, but the worst was coming. Antoku Tenno was 3 years old when he was enthroned. This series has encountered him before, in many contexts, always from the outside, always as the central presence around whom the events of the Genpei War's final years were organized, the symbolic center of the Taira's claim to legitimacy, the person whose safety was the primary justification for every decision the Taira made in the years of the retreat. From Kiyomori's perspective, Antoku was something more personal than this, something that the word symbol does not quite capture. He was the proof. A man who had spent his life building toward a specific goal, who had organized decades of effort around a vision of what was possible, who had survived the skepticism and the opposition and the specific dangers that the pursuit of such a goal inevitably produces, and who then sees the goal achieved, holds something in that moment that is different from what external observers see when they look at the same achievement. They see the outcome. He feels the proof that the vision was correct, the proof that the decades of effort were worth it, the proof that the specific combination of ambition and patience and intelligence and the willingness to keep going when the going was difficult had produced what it was supposed to produce. And Toku, enthroned at age 3, was this proof for Kiyomori. The boy himself was, by any account, an appealing child, as far as the records allow us to see him. He was, by the accounts that describe him, bright and calm and affectionate, a child whose specific qualities, whatever they were in the brief time he lived, are not what history has primarily remembered him for. History has remembered him primarily as the emperor who died at 8 years old in the cold water of Dan Nora, in his great-grandmother Nidono's arms. Kiyomori never saw this. He died before it happened. But the child he held in his arms in the brief period when his illness had not yet entirely incapacitated him, the 3-year-old grandson who was the emperor of Japan, was not the doomed child of history. He was simply a small boy, and Kiyomori was simply his grandfather. The relationship between grandfather and grandson is one of the relationships that political power, when it operates through the mechanism of dynastic succession, has always been organized around. The Fujiwara had understood this, had built their dominance around the specific relationship between powerful Fujiwara men and the imperial grandsons, who were simultaneously the heirs of the imperial institution and the children of Fujiwara daughters. Kiyomori had studied this model, he had replicated it, and now he had the thing itself, the specific personal experience of the relationship that the model had always been about, the grandfather holding the grandson, who was also the emperor. Kiyomori did not know, in the years after Antoku's enthronement, how short the time was. He knew he was ill. He knew the rebellion had started. He knew the specific challenges that the rebellion presented, both militarily and in terms of the political position the Taira needed to maintain to give its resistance to the rebellion legitimacy. But he did not know the outcome. No one in 1180 or 1181 knew the outcome with certainty. The outcome that we know, looking back from 8 centuries later, was not obvious in 1180. The Minamoto were powerful, but the Taira were not without resources. Yoritomo was capable, but so were the Taira commanders, including Tomonori, whose clear-sightedness this series has described, and Yoshitsune had not yet demonstrated the specific quality of his genius. Kiyomori, in the final year of his life, knew he was fighting a war he might not live to see the end of. He did not know it was a war his family would lose. The grandson, in these final months, was the specific human reality around which Kiyomori organized whatever clarity his illness allowed him to maintain. The child was the point. The child was the reason the whole architecture had been built. The child was the proof that the vision had been correct, and the decades of effort had been worth it. Kiyomori was dying. The war was beginning, and the grandson, who was 4 years old in the final months of Kiyomori's life, was in the imperial palace, surrounded by the apparatus of imperial authority, the living embodiment of everything Kiyomori had built. He was the proof. He was the answer to every question about whether the ambition had been worth it. 3 years after Kiyomori's death, Nidono would take him into the sea at Dan Nora. Kiyomori never knew. He died without knowing. And in the specific mercy of that ignorance, there is something that this story wants to acknowledge, however briefly. He built for his grandson. His grandson died in the sea at 8 years old. He never knew. The rebellion that began in the summer of 1180 has been described in this series from many perspectives, the perspectives of the people who were caught inside it as it developed, who experienced its campaigns and its retreats, and its final catastrophe from the specific positions they occupied within the Taira world. From Kiyomori's perspective, the rebellion had a specific quality that distinguished his experience of it from everyone else's. He had made it possible. Minamoto no Yoritomo, who raised his standard in the province of Izu in the summer of 1180 and began the war that would eventually destroy the Taira, was alive because Kiyomori had chosen not to kill him 21 years before. This fact, the fact that the leader of the force that was going to destroy everything Kiyomori had built, was a man Kiyomori had held in his hands as a child and had let live, was the specific irony that sits at the center of Kiyomori's story. Other figures in the Genpei War had their own specific irony, the specific quality of a situation that produced outcomes that the people inside it had not intended. Shigehira had not intended to burn the Daibutsu in the way that he did. Koromori had not intended to be the kind of warrior his family needed. Munemori had not intended to be the man who could not choose at Danura, but Kiyomori's irony is different from these. It is not the irony of unintended consequences, or of being unable to be what circumstances required. It is the irony of a specific decision, made with full agency, by a man at the height of his powers, that turned out to be the decision that undid everything. Why did Kiyomori spare Yoritomo? This series has noted that the chronicles present various explanations: the intercession of a woman who pleaded for the child, the assessment that the 9-year-old was too young to be a genuine threat. But there is another explanation that this series wants to consider, not as the definitive answer, but as one element of a more complex truth. Kiyomori may have spared Yoritomo because, at some level, killing a 9-year-old child ran against something in him that all his political intelligence could not override. This would be consistent with everything else we know about Kiyomori, who was brutal in pursuit of his political goals, but who was also, this series has suggested, not simply a man of pure instrumental calculation. He spared Yoritomo. He allowed the Minamoto blood to survive. He made the calculation that the child was not a threat, and he was wrong. The rebellion of 1180 had been building for years before Yoritomo raised his standard. The accounts of Yoritomo in exile in Izu, the province on the peninsula south of what is now Shizuoka, where he had lived since his father's defeat in the Heiji disturbance, describe a man who had spent 20 years in forced inactivity, watching the Taira consolidate their dominance, cultivating the relationships with the warrior families of the eastern provinces that would become the foundation of his eventual challenge. Yoritomo was not simply waiting. He was preparing. He was building, in the eastern provinces, the kind of web of relationships and obligations that Kiyomori had built at the national level in the 1160s and 1170s, the specific network of loyalties and mutual dependencies that would, when the moment arrived, give him a foundation to act from. When the moment arrived in 1180, Yoritomo moved quickly. The initial response of the eastern warrior families was uneven, some joining immediately, others hesitating, calculating the risks against the potential benefits of backing a cause that was not yet clearly the stronger one. But the response was sufficient to establish Yoritomo's rebellion as a genuine force rather than simply a local disturbance, and as the months passed and the rebellion's momentum built, the calculation of individual warrior families shifted in Yoritomo's favor. Kiyomori, receiving reports of these developments from his sickbed in Kyoto, understood what was happening. He understood it clearly, in the way that a man who had spent his life reading political situations could understand even when his body was failing him, the specific quality of a challenge that was not simply another rebellion to be suppressed, but something more fundamental, a challenge to the architecture of authority itself. The Taira response to the rebellion in the summer and autumn of 1180 was the response of a family that still had significant military resources and that believed, not unreasonably at that point, that these resources were adequate to suppress what was happening in the east. They sent forces. The forces achieved mixed results. This is not the place for a detailed accounting of the military campaigns of the Genpei War's early months, campaigns this series has discussed in the context of the specific figures who participated in them. What matters, for Kiyomori's story, is the trajectory. The rebellion was not suppressed. It continued to grow. The specific combination of Yoritomo's political skill and the military genius of the commanders he would eventually deploy, particularly Yoshitsune, proved more than adequate to exploit the weaknesses in the Taira's position that Kiyomori's methods had created. Kiyomori had built something extraordinary. It was coming apart, and he was running out of time to do anything about it. The burning of Nara in the 12th month of 1180 has been discussed in this series in the context of Shigehira's story, the son who was given the command, who arrived at the temple complex with a force intended to suppress the Sohei hostility, and whose forces, in the chaos of a night engagement, produced a fire that consumed Todaiji and Kofukuji and the Daibutsu. From Kiyomori's perspective, this event represents one of the clearest expressions of the specific quality of his judgment in these final months, and it is worth examining carefully. Kiyomori ordered the campaign against Nara, not in the sense of personally directing every tactical decision, but in the sense that the authorization for the campaign, the decision to send a military force against the great temples of Nara in response to Sohei hostility to the Taira, was made at a level of the Taira hierarchy that reported to Kiyomori. Kiyomori was the head of the family. The campaign was the family's campaign. The outcome was the family's outcome, and the outcome was the destruction of one of the most sacred sites in Japan. The religious establishment's response to the burning of Nara was the response that this series has described from Shigehira's perspective: horror, the specific quality of dismay that comes from witnessing an offense against something genuinely sacred, something that exists at the foundation of the civilization rather than at its margins. But the response extended beyond the religious establishment. The court families, watching from Kyoto, processed the burning of Nara as another demonstration of what Kiyomori's dominance meant in practice, another instance of the pattern that Shigemori had been arguing against, and that without Shigemori was now producing consequences on a scale that went beyond what even the most pessimistic assessment of the Taira's trajectory had anticipated. The wider population, whose relationship to the temples of Nara was not the philosophical relationship of the court aristocracy, but the immediate, personal, daily relationship of people who had prayed at these temples and whose religious life was organized around them, experienced the burning as something closer to a wound, the destruction of something that belonged to them and that the Taira had no right to destroy. Kiyomori's response to the burning of Nara was, by most accounts, not the response that the scale of the damage required. He did not perform the acts of contrition that the religious tradition, and the court culture more broadly, expected from a powerful figure in the aftermath of such damage. He did not make the kind of reparative gestures that might have, if not repaired the damage, at least signaled that he understood its magnitude. His response was, instead, the response of a man who was focused on the military and political crisis that the rebellion represented, for whom the burning of Nara was a complication, an additional front in a situation that was already complicated, rather than a moral reckoning that required a different kind of response. This response, or the perception of this response, did something to how Kiyomori was understood, not just by the court families or the religious establishment, both of whom had already positioned him as the primary threat to the values they represented, but by a broader population that had, until this point, related to the Taira's dominance primarily as a political fact, rather than a moral one. The burning of Nara made the moral dimension unavoidable. A government that destroyed the great temples was not simply powerful, it was impious. It had violated something that existed at a level below the political, something that no amount of political calculation had the standing to override. Kiyomori did not see it this way, or if he saw it, he did not act as if he saw it. He continued to manage the military crisis. He continued to make the decisions that the crisis required, as he understood them. He continued to be, despite the fever, and despite the burning of Nara, and despite everything else that was happening, the person whose decisions shaped what the Taira did. This is, in some ways, one of the more remarkable things about Kiyomori in these final months. However diminished his judgment may have been by illness, however much the specific quality of his political intelligence may have been eroded by the fever that was consuming him, he continued to function. He continued to be present. He continued to be, even in this diminished form, the center of the family's decision-making. The fire at Nara burned. The rebellion continued. Kiyomori continued, until he could not. The last year of Kiyomori's life was not a quiet ending. It was a year of crisis managed from a sickbed, of decisions made by a man whose body was failing him, but whose mind, to the extent that the fever allowed it to function, was still the most capable political mind in the family. The specific paradox of Kiyomori's final year is that he was, simultaneously, more needed and less capable than he had been at any previous point in his career. The crisis was larger than anything the Taira had previously faced. The rebellion was growing. The military situation was deteriorating. The political position, eroded by years of overreach, was more precarious than it had appeared, and the man whose judgment had, for decades, been the thing that kept the Taira's position together was lying on a bed, burning with fever, unable to personally direct the response that the situation required. The people around him in these final months were the people this series has described from their own perspectives. Mune Mori, the eldest surviving son, who held the formal position of heir, but who lacked, as this series has discussed at length, the specific qualities that position required. Kenreimon-in, his daughter, now the mother of the emperor, who was managing her own situation within the imperial household while her father's illness progressed. The other sons and daughters and grandchildren who populated the Taira household, each with their own specific relationship to the crisis that was developing, and their own specific capacity for responding to it. None of them were Kiyomori. The accounts of this period describe Kiyomori receiving reports of the military situation, sometimes responding with instructions, sometimes with outbursts of frustration at the news, sometimes with the kind of focused analysis that suggested his mind, even in these circumstances, was still working. He knew what was happening. He understood the situation. But understanding and being able to act effectively on that understanding are different things, and the specific gap between understanding and action, which had never been a significant problem for Kiyomori when he was healthy, was widening with each week of his illness. The Taira military response to the rebellion in this period was the response of a family that still had resources but that lacked the specific quality of direction that Kiyomori, at his best, had provided. Campaigns were organized and executed with varying degrees of effectiveness. Political negotiations were conducted with the court and with the provincial warrior families. The emperor was protected, the regalia was kept safe. but the coherence that had characterized the Taira's management of their position, the specific quality of integrated political and military thinking that Kiyomori had provided, was increasingly absent from the family's collective response to the crisis. The absence was Kiyomori's absence, present in the room, lying on the bed, burning with fever, but absent in the way that mattered, absent as the organizing intelligence that had held everything together. There is a specific quality to watching someone whose capabilities you have depended on losing those capabilities, a specific kind of grief that is different from the grief of straightforward loss, because the person is still there, is still present, is still in some sense themselves, but is no longer available in the way they were available, no longer able to be what they were. The people around Kiyomori in his final year were experiencing this. The sons and daughters who had grown up under the specific protection of his capabilities, who had lived their entire lives in a world organized around his judgment, were watching that judgment diminish, were realizing, perhaps for the first time, how much of what they had taken for granted as the structure of their world had been, in fact, the product of one specific man's specific capabilities. Kiyomori was still there, but the thing that had made him what he was, the thing that had built the world they lived in, was fading, and no one in the room had anything that could replace it. The dying wish of Tairano Kiyomori is one of the most discussed moments in the entire Heike Monogatari, a moment that has been read and interpreted and argued over for 8 centuries, a moment that seems to contain, in compressed form, something essential about who Kiyomori was and what he wanted and what he could not let go of, even in the final hours of his life. He did not ask for sutras to be chanted. He did not ask for the memorial services that would ensure his passage to the Pure Land. He did not make the kind of final religious preparations that the Buddhist practice of the period specified, and that many people in his situation would have prioritized. He asked for Yoritomo's head. The accounts of this final wish present it with a specificity that suggests it was remembered, by the people present, as something that needed to be remembered exactly, the specific content of the request of a dying man who had been the most powerful person in Japan for 2 decades. He said he wanted no offerings made at his grave. He said he did not want memorial services. He wanted Yoritomo's head placed before his grave. This was what he wanted. This was his dying wish. The reading of this wish that is most common, the reading that has shaped how many people have understood it across the centuries, is the reading of bitterness and unfinished business, a dying man who cannot release the unresolved conflict that has defined the final years of his life, who organizes his final thoughts around the enemy, who has undone what he spent his life building. This reading is not wrong. It contains something true. Kiyomori was dying with his life's work under attack. The rebellion that Yoritomo had started was not over. The family whose architecture he had built over decades was fighting a war he had not expected to fight. The bitterness was real. The unfinished business was real. But there is another reading that this series wants to offer alongside this one, not as a replacement but as an addition, a reading that sees in the dying wish not simply bitterness, but something more complex. Kiyomori, in his final hours, could have asked for many things. He could have asked to see his children and grandchildren, the people whose lives his work had made possible. He could have made the religious preparations that the tradition specified. He could have dictated instructions for the management of the family's affairs after his death. He asked for Yoritomo's head. This request was not, in any practical sense, something that could be fulfilled. Yoritomo was alive and in the east, at the head of a growing army. No one in the room with Kiyomori had the ability to put Yoritomo's head before his grave. The request, understood as a practical matter, was impossible. Understood as something else, as the final expression of what Kiyomori's life had been about, and what he was unable to release even in dying, it is more interesting. Kiyomori had spent his entire life pursuing a single coherent vision, the vision of a Taira ascendancy that would, through the specific combination of military capability and political sophistication, and strategic marriage and patient accumulation, become so embedded in the structures of Japanese power that it could not be undone. Yoritomo was the proof that this vision had failed, or rather, that it had succeeded in building something extraordinary, but had not succeeded in making that something permanent. The dying wish was not simply a wish for vengeance, it was a wish for the completion of the project, the elimination of the specific threat that stood between what Kiyomori had built and the permanence he had always intended. It was also, and this may be the most honest way to read it, the wish of a man who was not ready to stop. Kiyomori had never stopped. From the Hogan disturbance to this sickbed, his life had been organized around the relentless pursuit of a vision, and the relentlessness was not simply ambition, not simply the drive to accumulate power for its own sake, but the specific quality of a person for whom stopping, releasing, accepting that something was out of their control was genuinely difficult. The dying wish was the final expression of this quality. He could not stop. He was dying, and he could not stop. He wanted Yoritomo's head. He did not get it. Tairano Kiyomori died in the second month of 1181. He was 63 years old. The fever that had been consuming him for weeks, possibly longer, had reached the stage where the body could no longer sustain even the diminished form of activity that the sickbed had permitted, where the heat that the chronicles describe in such extraordinary terms had done what extreme fevers do, damaged the systems that sustain life past the point of recovery. He died. The accounts of his death describe it with the specific combination of physical detail and symbolic weight that the Heike Monogatari brings to the significant deaths in the chronicle, the deaths that are not simply the ends of individual lives, but the ends of eras, or the culminations of trajectories that the chronicle has been tracking. Kiyomori's death was both of these things. It was the end of an individual life, the life of a man who had been born in uncertain circumstances and had built, through decades of political and military genius, something that no warrior in Japanese history had previously built, who had placed his daughter in the imperial household and his grandson on the throne, who had accumulated power and position and formal authority on a scale that redefined what was possible for a warrior family in Heian Japan. And it was the end of an era, the era in which the Taira's ascendancy had been organized around the specific capabilities of the specific man who had built it, the era that had begun with the Hogan disturbance, and that ended, in the most direct sense, on the day in the second month of 1181 when Kiyomori died. The Genpei War would continue for 4 more years after Kiyomori's death. The Taira would fight at Ichinotani and Yashima and Dan-nora. Shigehira would be captured and eventually executed. Tomonori would watch everything end and choose his own ending with 2 anchors. Kenreimon-in would go into the sea and be given back, and spend the rest of her life in prayer in the mountain valley of Ohara. And Toku, the emperor who was Kiyomori's proof, would die in Nidono's arms in the cold water of Dan-nora at 8 years old. All of this would happen after Kiyomori's death. Kiyomori did not know any of it. What he knew when he died was the specific situation of the second month of 1181. The rebellion was underway. The outcome was uncertain. His family still held the emperor. The regalia was still in Taira hands. The war was not over. He died in the middle of it, which is different from dying at the end of it, different in the specific way that dying in the middle of something you have built leaves the thing itself, the work, the project, the architecture, still standing, still incomplete, still in the process of determining whether it will hold. He did not die in the ruins. He died while the building was still standing. This matters for understanding Kiyomori, because it means that the specific despair of watching what you built collapse was not something he experienced. The other figures in this series died, or made their final choices, or arrived at their final positions after the collapse, in the aftermath of Dan Nora, in the specific knowledge of what had happened to the world that Kiyomori had built. Kenreimon-in lived 30 years after Dan Nora, carrying that knowledge through the daily rhythms of Ohara. Tomonori experienced the collapse in real time, watched it happen piece by piece, and then chose his ending in full awareness of what had happened. Kiyomori died before any of this. He died in the second month of 1181, not knowing how the war would end. There is something in this, a mercy that the world did not intend and that Kiyomori did not ask for, something that distinguishes his death from the deaths of the people whose stories this series has told. He built it. He did not see it fall. He asked for Yoritomo's head and did not get it. And then he died, in the burning heat of the fever that had been consuming him, in the second month of 1181, 63 years old, the year before the Taira abandoned Kyoto forever. He had built everything. He had not seen the end of anything. He died in the middle. Everything else came after. What did Kiyomori build? This is the question that this series has been circling around from its first part, the question that every story in this series has been, in some sense, an attempt to answer from a different angle. This final part wants to look at the question directly. What Kiyomori built, in the most concrete terms, was a position for the Taira family within the structures of Japanese power that was, at its peak, unlike anything a warrior family had previously achieved. Control of military force throughout Japan, control of the major provincial governorships, control of the court appointments through which formal authority was distributed, a blood connection to the imperial succession through his daughter's marriage and his grandson's enthronement. This position was built over 2 decades, through the specific combination of military capability and political intelligence and strategic marriage and patient accumulation that this series has described. It was real, it was extraordinary, it was, for approximately a decade, the organizing fact of Japanese political life. What Kiyomori built, in the less concrete but more durable sense, was a precedent. Before Kiyomori, the question of how far a warrior family could go in transforming its military power into political authority had a practical answer that was significantly more limited than the theoretical answer. After Kiyomori, the answer to this question had changed. He had demonstrated that a warrior family could, with sufficient capability and sufficient patience, insert itself into the heart of the court system, could use the court's own instruments to build a position that was not simply military, but genuinely political, could place its blood on the imperial throne. He had done this. The doing of it changed what was possible. Yoritomo, watching Kiyomori from his exile in Izu, learned from what Kiyomori had done, and built on it, and eventually produced something more durable than what Kiyomori had built, the Kamakura government, which was the first warrior government in Japanese history, and which governed Japan for more than a century. Kiyomori made Yoritomo's achievement possible, not just by sparing his life, but by demonstrating the specific mechanisms through which warrior power could be transformed into governing authority. What Kiyomori built, in the terms that this series has been using throughout, was the world in which all the stories this series has told took place. The world in which Kenreimon-in grew up as the daughter of the most powerful man in Japan and became an empress and lost everything. The world in which Kumagai Naozane fought as a warrior and found, on the beach at Ichinotani, the question that the warrior framework could not answer. The world in which Tomoe Gozen rode beside Yoshinaka and would not leave until ordered to. The world in which Shigehira burned the Daibutsu and carried that burning for the rest of his life. The world in which Tomonori saw everything clearly and chose the end he chose. The world in which Koromori left his wife and children and walked toward Nachi. The world in which Munemori stood on the ship at Dan Nura and could not choose. The world in which Atsumori carried a flute into battle inside his helmet. The world in which Shigemori spent his life trying to stop his father and ran out of time. All of these worlds were the world Kiyomori built. All of these lives were the lives that world produced. Kiyomori's specific achievement and Kiyomori's specific failure is that he built something real and built it without adequate foundations. The achievement was real. The architecture was genuine. The position he created was, at its height, exactly what he had intended it to be. But the foundations were, as Shigemori understood, and as the events of the Genpei War demonstrated, insufficient to support what had been built on them. Not because the ambition was wrong, not because the vision of what a warrior family could achieve was itself mistaken, but because the specific way Kiyomori pursued this ambition, the instrumental relationship to the court's legitimacy structures, the treatment of the obligations of genuine service as tools to be used rather than values to be lived, produced the specific accumulation of resentment that eventually gave the rebellion its force. He was both of these things, the man who built the most ambitious political architecture in Japanese history up to his time, the man whose specific methods of building created the conditions for that architecture's destruction, the father whose sons and daughter and grandson lived and died inside what he had made, each in their own way, each with their own specific relationship to the world he had created. The man who spared Yoritomo and could not have known what that sparing would mean. The man who died asking for Yoritomo's head. Kiyomori was 63 years old. He died in the second month of 1181. He had built everything this series has explored. He had not seen any of it fall. The Heike Monogatari begins with the sound of the bell at Gion Shoja, the bell that announces that all things are impermanent, that the proud do not endure, that the mighty fall at last. Kiyomori is the person the opening lines are about. He is the specific example of the universal truth that the Heike Monogatari opens by announcing. He built, he peaked, he fell, not personally, not in the sense of experiencing the fall that everything he built eventually underwent, but in the sense that the arc of his story, from the uncertain birth to the extraordinary ascent, to the peak, to the illness, to the dying wish, to the death in the middle of the war he had made possible, is the arc that the bell at Gion Shoja announces. The proud do not endure. Kiyomori did not endure, but he built the world that this series has been exploring, and that world, in its specific beauty and its specific catastrophe, was real. It was, for the people inside it, the only world there was. Kiyomori built it. It was his.